Many of you are here today because you have connections to Randolph Caldecott or MauriceSendak. I began each day of my first year of teaching listening to Carole King sing Chicken Soup and Rice. A Hole is to Dig has been a favorite gift not just for children, but for first-year law students and adults in need of a hug. And Where the Wild Things was the first baby book gift that was given to my now 23-year-old. And because of Caldecott, each year we celebrate this amazing art found in children's books. Each of the featured books today, Leonard captures immediately the artist, his time, and the context of his life and work. There are so many golden nuggets of information in each volume. They're going to become part of my personal library. My one personal favorite description is that Leonard describes New York City as not only the home to Maurice Sendak, but Sendak's personal Oz. And it is fitting for Leonard to discuss amazing connections that bring Caldecott and Sendak together. So sit back and enjoy and listen to a master.
Well, thank you all for coming this afternoon. I was thinking that these two books look in relation to each other sort of the way Laurel looked to Hardy. One is big and one is very thin. But that's not an inappropriate analogy because, among other things, Maurice Sendak was fascinated with Oliver Hardy. And both of these two artists, Randolph Caldecott from the 19th century and Sendak from our time, were brilliant comedians, and they were very good at telling a story in a pithy way, which is what people like Laurel and Hardy and Abbott Costello were so good at too. And what I really want to talk about today is how these two artists are linked to each other. And the link is very, very close. Both were self-taught artists, for one thing. Sendak didn't even go to college, let alone to art school. And Randolph Caldecott was destined to be a bank clerk. That's what his father wanted him to be in the middle of the 19th century. But he would doodle on the bank slips. And he realized pretty early on that drawing was his life. And he found any possible way that he could to live that way. And they were both artists who were revolutionary in a way, and having to do with the way picture books are made, the things that we call picture books today. Okay, so birds of a feather. Randolph Caldecott looks kind of like one of the brothers on the Smith Brothers cough drop commercial. You wouldn't guess that this man was very funny and someone you would have loved to meet. He was born in the English Midlands in 1846. He had a baritone voice. Midlands is a more down-to-earth place than London, certainly at the higher reaches of society. So if you were to picture what he would sound like if you could talk to him, think of Ringo Starr. He was tall, lanky, good-looking. His father, as I said, wanted him to have a safe career, but he was determined to be an artist. And he moved from a very small rural bank when he was in his early 20s, or actually in his late teens, to a really big bank in Manchester when he was about 20. Manchester, in the middle of the 19th century, was the epicenter of the Industrial Revolution. That's where all the masters of the cotton trade had their headquarters. And he was working for the biggest bank in Manchester. And he was very good at what he did. He called himself a quill driver. But he began staying up all night, drawing the workers and the other people who were out in the streets at night, and had sketchbook after sketchbook. The subtitle of my book about him is The Man Who Could Not Stop Drawing, because that is what he was. He took up watercolor, he took up painting, he took up sculpture. He tried everything to become an artist. And after about 6 years, he went to London with a year's worth of expenses in his pocket and tried his luck. This is another picture of him. It begins to come closer to what he was really like. I found this at the Houghton Library at Harvard University, which has a really good collection of Caldecott's artwork. You can see the twinkle in his eye, the sparkle. Here are some of the sketches that he made of his fellow bank clerks. He was incorrigible. He was good at his job, though, and so they tolerated that. And in fact, everybody loved him. Not every artist that you admire for their work is someone you would want to meet, but Caldecott, I think, clearly was somebody that almost anybody would have thought a worthy friend. Here he is trying watercolor. These are from the British Museum. Now, what was going on in his time? It was the beginning of train travel, and life was speeding up. It was all part of the Industrial Revolution. He was fascinated by trains, and he began to draw on trains because the rhythm and the speed of the train would give him a little boost of energy, and he loved that. Lewis Carroll used to like to write on trains. They were near contemporaries. And artists, this is by Joseph Turner. This is, as you can see, is a locomotive coming at you. It's as much about, and even more about, the energy of the train as it is about the physical being of the train. So artists were trying to find out how to capture this new thing that was happening in their world, this acceleration of everything, time, space, and life itself. So lots of artists were doing images of trains. This is by Walter Crane, another illustrator of the mid-late 19th century. Something else that was happening was that Japanese prints were coming to Europe. They first came to Paris in the 1850s, and quickly the English artists were looking at them too. If you think of Victorian times, you think of heavy furniture and very crowded parlors, and the artwork was very often crowded too, overstuffed, like a sofa. When these artists started seeing what was happening in Japan, they looked at art in a different way, in image making, and it was Robert Browning, the poet, who said less is more. And this began to influence Caldecott's way of making pictures, as it did Whistler, who was a friend of his in London. It's also a time of great activity in decorative arts. This is a William Morris chair. William Morris was friends with Crane, and Crane was friends with Caldecott, so all these people knew each other once they got to be in London together. And he was all about craftsmanship and going back, getting away from machine-made things to handmade things. And Caldecott was somebody who, as a guy who drew with a pencil or a pen, was being a craftsman on the page. It was also a time when people were trying to invent motion pictures, and this goes back to what was happening with railroads and the sense of the pace of life. How can you make images that seem to literally come to life before your very eyes? And this became the great ambition for Caldecott as an artist making picture books for children. Someone else who was doing that was Edward Mybridge, the photographer. These are stop-action pictures. He was trying to understand how motion actually works. You know, what exactly happens when somebody jumps or when a horse gallops. He and Caldecott were exact contemporaries, and there's pretty good reason to think that Caldecott knew what Mybridge was doing. It was also a time when people were making children's books not with the purpose of teaching a moral lesson, and this was a new idea, to not do that, but instead to make books that were just a lot of fun, and that maybe finding out that books can be fun, that reading can be enjoyable, is the lesson. And Edward Lear was one of the first people to do that in this book of limericks in the 1840s. This was a book that came out within a year of Caldecott's birth, so it's one that he might very well have known as a child. This is typical of what picture books looked like when Caldecott was young. They were very stiffly designed. The words were in one place, the pictures were in the other. The machinery didn't yet exist to do pictures in color, so this had to be colored by hand, copy after copy. This is what Caldecott was going to change, move away from this to something a lot more exciting. Here you can see another old-fashioned picture book, and the subject is trains. That's how preoccupied everybody was with the new industrial age. And here is another Caldecott self-portrait, and you can really begin to see what a fun guy he was and how he liked to make fun of himself. Here he is in London showing prospective patrons one of his latest paintings. This was when he was just starting out, and he knew he was going to be an artist, but he didn't really know, where he was going to make his name. When he moved to London, he found the best place he could possibly have done to live. It was in this building, and it's directly across from the British Museum. That was great because the museum was free, and it was filled with animal specimens, armor, Greek and Roman sculpture, everything that a young artist trying to learn how to draw would want to draw. So, and when he got tired of going in the museum, he would just stand in the courtyard and draw the pigeons. So it was just great. And here you can see one of his, if you can see that, two of his sketchbooks made inside the museum. I found a lot of these sketchbooks. Some were in England, some were at Harvard, and three of them belonged to a friend of mine, it turned out. I hadn't realized that, but she mentioned it, and they turned out to be the very last sketchbooks that he'd ever drawn in, which is kind of great. He got started doing magazine illustrations. Had he been alive today, he probably would have worked for The New Yorker or something close to that, if there is anything close to that. They tended to be comic. Some of them were published in Punch, the humor magazine, others in a fancy illustrated magazine called The Graphic, which was published in London, and another one called London Society. He had a knack for caricature, a knack for the humorous moment. His father had been both an accountant and a hatter in a little town called Chester. And Caldecott loved to show people losing their hats. I think that's a very typical way of him making gentle fun of something from his own life. Early on in his London days, he... there's the hat picture. And he always illustrated his letters when he wrote to his friends. Imagine getting one of those. Well, I think, it turns out a lot of illustrators do that. And I find, as I get to know more of them and about more of their work, that illustrators tend to never stop drawing. I mean, I've seen reams and reams of drawings by some people. And there was one named Gustav Klimt who did a lot of golden books. And he not only dated his artwork, but he would write the time of day that he did a particular drawing. That's how much he was doing. This is a drawing that Caldecott probably made on a train. And it was a sketch for what became one of his first picture books. And it was The House That Jack Built, which is an old Mother Goose story rhyme. And he was given the chance, about 6 years after arriving in London, to make picture books that would be printed in color with a new technology that hadn't existed before. So suddenly, you didn't have to do it by hand. The machine would do it, and it would be really, really beautiful. He was working with a perfectionist printer named Edmund Evans, who also published children's books by Walter Crane, who I mentioned before, and by Kate Greenaway, who I didn't. But these three were a kind of triumvirate of artists who were venturing into this new world, made possible in part by the Industrial Revolution, because there were all these new printing technologies. And also the trains were making it possible for books to be sold over big markets. So that was related also. And most importantly, as London became a bigger and bigger city and England became more industrialized, there were more and more middle-class families who wanted books for their children. They realized that education was important and that reading and love of books was a key to that. So that's really why children's books had such a big presence in England, starting in the 18th century. And by the time Caldecott came along 100 years later, it was a really major thing. There was a huge audience for those books. And the artists who might have gone in some other direction began to see that this is an honorable and up-and-coming outlet for talent. And so Caldecott was very much game to try it. Here you see the beginning of The House That Jack Built, and I'm going to show you now one of the finished illustrations. That in itself doesn't look that exciting, but here's we're getting into a little more action. The cat is really ready to pounce. If you could see that closely, you could pretty much see the muscles, and you could see the look of excitement in this cat's eyes. And this is where Caldecott really takes off. Even with just a line drawing, he's making these characters look like they're just jumping out of their pants to deliver that pie to the king. The scene on the left takes place several minutes before the scene on the right. So he's invented the fast forward, later seen in film. And he's playing with the gutter, that line that separates the left from the right, in an interesting way. It becomes a demarcation not of place but of time. And everything about that drawing is alive. And this is what Caldecott was a master of, making his characters seem to do something. You can see how children, who are always kind of moving around, would have found that appealing. His books were enormously popular right from the beginning. They sold like 50,000 copies in the first year, which would be a great number today. This is from Hey Diddle Diddle, The Cat and the Fiddle. The cat, what is it? Cow ran away with the who ran away with the spoon? The dish, right, there it is. Yeah, okay. Well, you know what? This is a great example, I mean, not only of his sense of humor and of how he was able to draw and make things come alive, but also you never really find out what happens to the dish and the spoon when they run away, but he tells you, and it's actually rather sad. There's a trip up there, and a dish is broken, and we've already come to think of this dish as a living, loving creature. But of course, it's all in fun. So it shows you that he's giving you life, in all of its emotional colorings for little children and anybody else who is interested. One of the people who was interested was the father of Beatrix Potter. And in Caldecott's lifetime, he was a barrister, but also a very interesting amateur photographer, it turns out, and an art collector. And one of the artists whose work he collected was Randolph Caldecott. And Beatrix Potter grew up looking at Caldecott originals on the wall of her home. And some of them are of frogs in human dress. And if you think of the book Jeremy Fisher, you see that she was really learning a lot from Caldecott. In fact, it was the one book that he did with frogs in human dress that they had originals from in their home in London. Anyway, so she became the next part of the next generation, learning from him, and Sendak the next after that, which we'll come to in a moment. Now here are 4 of his book covers. Now his books were sold from newsstands on railroad platforms, and trains would come whizzing by, and he knew that, and he'd worked in a bank. He was thinking of his customers. And he said, I want them to be able to see my books from a passing train. So he made book covers intentionally that looked like posters that could be seen from far away. About like this. They were paperbacks, but they weren't the cheapest kind of paperback. They would have, it's hard to translate, but they cost a shilling, whereas other picture books cost 6 pence. Shilling, I think, is 14 pence. That gives you an idea. But people thought they were worth it. So they were like almost they're about 2.5 times what the average little children's book would have cost. This is actually Kate Greenaway, the woman artist pictured at the head of the parade. And Caldecott has drawn himself bringing up the rear. This is it's like a model. I mean, there's no person there. It's just an outfit that has been set up kind of like a scarecrow. And it's not clear from this picture whether the artists are all fooled into thinking that's really a cute little girl that they must run and capture on paper. Caldecott was making fun of the sentimental side of the children's book art of his day. And he, I think, pointed a finger at Kate Greenaway for being among the leaders of the sort of sweet and precious sort of school of children's book illustration. So I think, part of what's going on here is he's showing up late because he wasn't really that interested in doing something like that anyway. This is the image that he's most famous for. It's the one that ended up on the medal, which is named for him. And that's the medal given by the American Library Association for the best illustrated book of the year by an American resident or citizen. It's interesting that it was named after an English person, but it can only be given to an American. And the reason for that is the award was started in the 1930s, so that was long after Caldecott, who died in 1886, long after he had died. But America at that time was still looking to England for a lot of its culture, and the publishers and librarians wanted to change that. They were saying, well, we're becoming a strong nation. We saved Europe in World War I. We should have our own culture too. So they honored the past by naming the award after Caldecott, but it was meant to be an incentive to American artists to do as well. So there it is. And here you can see, I'm sorry? Oh, well, I can tell you, it was a man named René Chambalin. He was a French artist who lived in New York. He did the fountains in Rockefeller Center. So he was, doing various public sculptures and things. And so he based it pretty closely on that image I just showed you. And this is by Robert McCluskey, of course, just to show you how Caldecott's way of drawing extended way beyond his own work. Here's something that was from the 40s. This is from the 50s. Nicholas Mordvinoff, who won the Caldecott Medal in, I think, 1951. And Maurice Sendak, too, really. Now, there's the very young Maurice Sendak in a self-portrait. Sendak grew up in Brooklyn, which to him was like the Midlands of England. It was the hinterlands. It was far from the center of things, which was Manhattan. And he dreamed of moving there, and he was a teenager when he did. He didn't go to college because he was ready to go. He wanted to get started. And he worked at the F.A.O. Schwartz toy store for a while, working on the windows and the displays in the store. And that's where his sketchbooks were seen by Ursula Nordstrom, the great editor at Harper, who gave him his first assignment when he was about 20 years old. And he was a demonic worker. He just worked. In that way, too, he was like Caldecott. There were years when he did 7 or 8 books, illustrated them, which is a phenomenal amount of work. It's unusual to do more than 1 or 2 a year for most illustrators. And here, from this picture, you can see that he was very serious and took himself very seriously, and that he was very confident, especially considering that he had essentially taught himself how to do it all. This is a book that was, popular and honored around the time that Sendak's career was beginning. And Robert McCluskey's work is wonderful. But it gives a much sunnier view of life and of childhood than Sendak would go on to do. And this was the kind of thing that he was reacting against. As was this. Just a typical picture of a happy child in nature. Sendak was about city life and about being unhappy, or at least having a whole range of feelings. So he looked elsewhere for his inspiration, and Sendak was probably the most original illustrator of the last 40 or 50 years for children, but nobody knew more about the tradition that came before him than he did. So it's not really a paradox to say that he was both original and that he was totally steeped in the work of everyone who had come before him. This happens to be from a German picture book of the 1840s. In English, it would be known as Slovenly Peter or Shock-Headed Peter. It was a parody of cautionary tales done in a really over-the-top, extreme way. Boys and girls who misbehave and awful things happen to them, and they deserve it. In the perverse logic of the book. So it's meant to caution other children not to do the same. But the author was really making fun of the books that were truly like that and saying to children who would read them, well, we know that that's not the way to talk to you. We're going to have this joke together and have a laugh over it all. But you could see a little bit of Max in that boy who just went by Peter. And another thing that Sendak was really in love with was Mickey Mouse, the comic books and the animations of his childhood. So he was mixing high and low culture any way he could. And here, in a drawing which is in this book about Sendak that I have put together, is a kind of assembled cast of characters for some of the favorite characters and influences that affected Sendak's work over the years. Well, it's in the private collection of a man named Justin Schiller, and Justin is an antiquarian book dealer who was a friend of Maurice Sendak for 40 years and was the person who formed Maurice Sendak's own collection of rare books. And very often, rather than take money for the things that Justin would offer him for his collection, he would trade and get some of Sendak's artwork. And so he formed this amazing collection of mostly artwork which was not published before. And that's what ended up in this book. So, I mean, I have to say, as someone who had written a lot about Sendak before I had a chance to work on this project, that I thought I had a pretty good idea, of what he had done. And then I saw Justin Schiller's collection of artwork, and I realized there was this whole other side to his career, and I'm going to show you more of it now. One of the things I learned from looking at all of this art was how patient Maurice Sendak was, and how he was often willing to wait for years to find the right way to tell a story that he knew he wanted to tell. And the best known and already pretty widely published about or publicized example of that is Where the Wild Things Are. What you see here is a dummy, a kind of mock-up experiment toward a finished book that he made in 1955. You can see that's very oddly shaped. It's very, very like maybe 1 inch tall and maybe 8 inches long. And the title of it is Where the Wild Horses Are. Now, in 1955, he was about 5 or 6 years into his publishing career. He'd already illustrated about 15 or 20 books, which is extraordinary. And many people who are illustrators have the wish to write a book that they can illustrate to. They want to become the person in charge of the whole project. And many illustrators don't see themselves as verbal or literary people. So it's a big mountain to climb for a lot of illustrators. And he was in that position at that point. He was dying to do a complete book. And he wanted it to be a book in the spirit of Randolph Caldecott. And if you can look into those little skinny pages there, you can see horses. And, of course, it's called Where the Wild Horses Are. And it's about a boy, and you can see that the boy's getting on the back of one of the wild horses and then getting thrown off. His clothes are flying off as he's flying off, which will remind you a little bit of In the Night Kitchen, another Sendak book that came later. So there was all this stuff percolating in his imagination. He didn't know quite what to do with it. And he really couldn't figure out what that boy was doing there, what the story was. So he put this in a drawer and left it there for 7 years. Meanwhile, he illustrated about 20 other books, or maybe 30, and wrote a few. And then he did a second dummy in May of 1963. Where the Wild Things Are was published in November of that same year. So that isn't a whole lot of time between being involved in dummy making and having a book appear on a bookshelf. But that's what happened. After all that long waiting, things started moving at sort of lightning speed. If you could see the words that he hand lettered into that little dummy, you'll see that it says wild horses, and that he crossed out the word horses and wrote in things. So in a way, that's the moment when he realized, or so he said, that he couldn't draw horses well enough, and therefore he would call them things which could look like anything he chose. And then he added these pictures, which he would jokingly say were based on his relatives. Interestingly, as he moved from this dummy to the final art, the wild things gained weight. As he became more confident, he flushed them out, and they seemed much more solid, like they really, needed to be there. So this is the cover of his book, and one thing that's kind of notable about this cover is that the hero of the book, Max, is not there. And if you think about every other picture book you've ever seen, you'll realize how unusual that is. In fact, the only other picture book that I know of where this is the case is Goodnight Moon. And it was published by the same editor about 15 years earlier. And in both cases, the idea was we want the child looking at this book to feel it's their book. And we want to leave an opening for them to get inside the book. But this cover, if it were offered to an editor today, would be rejected. It's not a selling cover. It doesn't tell you who the book is about, and it doesn't look you in the eye. It doesn't do any of the things that a selling cover is supposed to do. At least, I don't think so. Here are other examples of Sendak revisiting something or taking his time. In 1973, he did a book of Grimm's fairy tales with one very powerful, detailed pencil drawing per story. And there's a little one called The Goblins, which is about goblins who sneak in and take a baby away, snatch a baby. And this was a drawing that he did and finished for that story, and then decided he could do a better one. And this is the one that got published. I actually love this one. It's one of my favorites of everything that he ever did. But that's not bad either. Here's what In the Night Kitchen might have looked like. He was considering using Stan Laurel, Buster Keaton, instead of Oliver Hardy. So he had this vaudeville idea in his mind, but Oliver Hardy was the most extreme character visually, so I guess that's why he settled on him. But you can also see that he's just trying a different line, a different texture, looking for the exact look. This is a lot paler. So he wanted impact. This book was kind of outrageous because in those days being 1970, most teachers or librarians would have said to children, stay away from comic books. They're not good for you. They're not good for anything. So here is this guy provoking them really by saying, look, well, I'm going to make a picture book and it's going to be a comic book too. And then he threw in a naked boy, which, in case you thought the comics were okay. In the late 70s, he decided to learn to be a printmaker, and he studied etching. His motive really was to make multiple images based on some of his books so they could be sold in galleries and so on. But it was a new art form for him and potentially a new way to illustrate books too. So that's hand-colored, but the line is etched. This is something I didn't know anything about. Here is an etching based on where the wild things are, but also outside over there. That boat could be the father's boat outside over there. The father's a sailor who's away at sea. So this was done around the time he was doing outside over there, and it shows him kind of mixing the worlds of different stories, reconciling them in some way. This is very large. It's huge. It's really spectacular. And he did the sets and costumes for 12 operas, as well as ballets. And this is a hand-painted chair for Prokofiev's The Love for Three Oranges, with a translation by Tom Stoppard. And he did commercial work. I used to wonder, what does he do all day? Because, he would publish a book every year or two or three, and then you'd think, oh, well, he's probably, just kind of walking around or something. But the truth was, he was always doing some artwork every day. And this was for a beer company. He did these funny drawings of, beer drinkers from Bavaria, from the Middle Ages or something. And these are some of the many, many drawings that he did for an advertising campaign for Bell Atlantic, the phone company. When Bell Atlantic, when it became a much bigger company, and the technology kept changing, and things were going digital. And the same thing happened when computers became personal computers. There was this big problem of how do you get the public to not feel anxious about a new technology. So they hired Sendak to create these fantasies that would sort of diffuse the tension that people might feel about the brave new world of technology that they found themselves in. And I've seen the animations, the commercials that were made based on these drawings, and they're really gorgeous. And he did a cow, the way many other artists did, to be put out in the street as a kind of street public art project. And here, back to Randolph Caldecott, he loved to go to France, and he loved to draw for children. And here you see him in Brittany. And here to conclude is a drawing that Maurice Sendak made based on that drawing, in which he has his Wild Thing learning how to draw by looking over Randolph Caldecott's shoulder. Thus my connection. Yeah, that's from Hey Diddle Diddle. Exactly. Yeah. So he's bringing them together, as was his wont. Well, thank you very much for listening.